Everyone believed the billionaire's only son had been born completely deaf. For years, he lived in silence, never speaking a word, never reacting to sound. Dozens of doctors confirmed it. His father built an entire world around this diagnosis: expensive therapies, assistive technologies, and routines built on silence. Nothing ever worked. But when a quiet, observant maid was hired to help care for the child, everything changed. She didn't try to fix him. She just watched. And what she discovered hidden beneath years of assumptions shocked everyone. The boy wasn't what they thought, and the truth behind his condition was something no one saw coming. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Wakefield lived in a large and quiet mansion far from the city. The place was surrounded by tall trees and long, empty fields. Inside, everything felt cold and lifeless. Richard was a man who once had a happy family, but everything changed after the helicopter crash that killed his wife. Since then, he lived alone with his only son, Leo. Leo was born deaf and never spoke a single word. He showed no reaction to sound or speech. Doctors had confirmed his condition early on, and Richard did everything he could to adapt. He filled the house with special devices and tools to help Leo communicate. Flashing lights, vibrating alarms, screens with subtitles, everything was there, but nothing worked. Leo remained distant, living in silence. Richard walked through the halls, feeling the emptiness growing each day. Even though the mansion was big and full of things, it felt like a hollow shell, missing its soul. Leo spent most of his time sitting by the window, staring into nothing. He didn't play with toys, didn't smile, and didn't cry. He never asked for anything. His face stayed the same all the time, blank, unreadable. Richard tried many times to reach him. Every morning he would kneel beside Leo and speak slowly, hoping that somehow his son would understand. He used gestures, showed drawings, and tried to act out stories, but Leo's eyes didn't follow. Richard wasn't angry. He was sad and tired. He wanted to believe there was something inside Leo's silence, some hidden thought or feeling. The boy's room was filled with soft colors and devices designed to make him comfortable, but none of it mattered. Richard couldn't tell if Leo even noticed. It was like trying to connect with a ghost. Sometimes, Richard caught himself just staring at Leo for hours, waiting for a single reaction. But Leo remained still, locked in his own unreachable world. Despite everything, Richard never gave up. He followed a strict routine, believing it might help Leo feel safe. Every morning, they had breakfast together in silence. Richard prepared the same meal, toast, eggs, and milk, placing the plate in front of Leo, who ate slowly without looking up. Then they spent time in the living room, where Richard told stories. He sat in a chair and spoke clearly, pointing at pictures and showing emotions with his hands. He read fairy tales, real-life stories, and even made up his own. Leo didn't react to any of them. Still, Richard kept trying. In the afternoons, they walked around the mansion's garden. Richard talked about the plants, the trees, the sky, and anything he could think of. Leo followed him quietly, always a few steps behind. Sometimes Richard paused, turned around, and signed something simple like tree or flower. Leo rarely looked at him, but Richard hoped that one day something would change. At night, Richard made sure Leo had everything he needed. He helped him take a warm bath, dressed him in soft pajamas, and sat beside him in bed. Before turning off the light, he told one last story. It became a habit. Richard always ended the day with a tale about a brave boy who didn't speak, but could change the world. He hoped Leo might see himself in those stories. Richard watched his son's face closely, searching for the smallest sign of recognition, a blink, a tear, a smile. But nothing ever came. Richard often left Leo's room with a heavy heart. Once in his own room, he stared at the ceiling, wondering what else he could do. He missed his wife deeply. She used to be the one full of energy, the one who believed that Leo would one day surprise them. Now, it was just him, holding on to that hope alone. Every night, he promised himself he wouldn't give up. The mansion itself had started to feel like a cage. Every room reminded Richard of a time when life was different. The kitchen still had his wife's favorite teacup on the shelf. The living room had a family photo, Richard, his wife, and baby Leo. Dust had gathered on everything, but Richard couldn't bring himself to throw anything away. He often wandered through the house, touching old furniture, turning on lights in empty rooms, just to feel some sense of presence. The silence was everywhere, not just from Leo, but from the whole place. No music, no laughter, no conversation. Even the air seemed still. Sometimes Richard talked to himself just to hear a voice echo through the halls. He often spoke about simple things, what he made for lunch, what the weather looked like, or what memory came back to him. It was his way of keeping sane, of filling the silence that never seemed to end. But through all the sadness, Richard didn't let go of his belief. He truly thought that one day, Leo would change. He imagined it often, maybe a small gesture, or a sound, or even eye contact. He believed that if he stayed kind, patient, and loving, something might reach Leo. He didn't blame the boy. He never did. Instead, he tried harder to create a safe space. Richard believed that if Leo ever felt something, anything, he would show it. That belief kept him going. It gave him strength to wake up each day, prepare breakfast, tell stories, and walk beside Leo in silence. Even though the days were always the same, Richard saw everyone as a new chance, a new opportunity to break through the wall between them. And so, even when exhausted, even when nothing seemed to improve, he kept going, because deep down, he truly believed that someday, somehow, everything could change. Julia Bennett arrived at the Wakefield mansion with only one small suitcase in her hand. Her clothes were plain, her hair tied back and her eyes tired. She had traveled a long way, not just in distance, but in life. Months earlier, Julia had lost her newborn son after a difficult labor. The pain was still with her, quiet and deep. She didn't cry in public anymore, but inside, she still felt broken. When she saw the job posting for a housekeeper at a private estate, she didn't think twice. She wasn't looking for money or career. She just wanted to be somewhere else, somewhere quiet, away from the memories. The Wakefield mansion looked cold and distant, but Julia didn't mind. She felt like she belonged in a place like that now. When Richard opened the door, she greeted him politely, her voice calm and low. She didn't smile too much or try to make small talk. That wasn't who she was anymore. Richard wasn't sure what to expect when he interviewed Julia. He had seen many people come and go, most of them full of energy or trying too hard to act friendly. Julia was different. She stood still, listened carefully, and answered only what was necessary. There was something about the way she respected silence that caught Richard's attention. He didn't feel the need to explain everything to her. She seemed to understand the kind of house she was entering. During the interview, Julia didn't ask many questions. She only wanted to know what time she should start and what Richard expected from her. He noticed she didn't avoid eye contact, but she didn't stare either. It felt natural. After a short pause, Richard decided to hire her. There was no dramatic moment, no handshake full of emotion. Just a simple, quiet agreement. Julia would start the next morning. Richard gave her a small guest room near the back of the mansion and left her to settle in. Julia unpacked her suitcase slowly that night. She didn't have many things. Just a few sets of clothes, some personal items, and a small photo of her baby. She placed the photo inside the nightstand drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it close. The room was simple, with white walls, a bed, and a small window. It was enough. The silence of the house didn't bother her. In fact, she liked it. She walked through the halls quietly, getting a feel for the space. The floors were clean but old, and the lights were dim. Everything felt untouched, like time had stopped inside the mansion. She passed by rooms that were closed, others with furniture covered in dust covers. She didn't try to open anything or go where she wasn't invited. Julia wasn't curious in the usual way. She preferred to observe first, speak later. That night, she slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. The next morning, Richard gave Julia a basic list of tasks. Clean the kitchen, dust the hallway, make sure Leo's room stayed tidy. He didn't say much about Leo, only that he was quiet and had his own routine. Julia listened and nodded. She didn't ask about the boy. She knew that if something was important, she would find out in time. Later that day, she passed by Leo's room and saw the door slightly open. She looked inside, not stepping in. Leo was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, holding a worn-out stuffed animal in his arms. His eyes stared at the carpet. He didn't move or look up. Julia stayed still for a moment, just watching him. She didn't say anything. There was something about him that caught her attention, not his hearing, but the loneliness that seemed to surround him. It felt familiar. Julia slowly stepped away, letting the door close quietly behind her. In the following days, Julia did her work quietly and carefully. She didn't make noise, didn't play music, and didn't try to start conversations unless needed. She noticed how the house ran. Meals were quiet, Richard stayed in his office most of the time, and Leo was always alone. She didn't try to force anything. When she passed Leo in the hallway, she simply nodded. Sometimes he looked at her, sometimes he didn't. Julia never pushed. She respected his space, just like she wanted people to respect hers. In the kitchen, she made small changes. She organized the shelves, wiped down surfaces more thoroughly, and left things a little neater each day. Richard noticed, but didn't say much. He didn't have to. He saw that Julia was consistent, reliable, and gentle. There was no drama, no strong personality, just a calm presence. And in a house filled with silence and memories, that was exactly what they needed. Julia's connection with Leo wasn't built through words or actions. It was through presence. She didn't try to entertain him or cheer him up. She simply noticed him. She noticed how he always held the same stuffed animal, how he sat in the same corner of the room, and how his eyes followed the light on the walls. Julia didn't say anything about it, but she adjusted her cleaning schedule so she wouldn't disturb him when he was in his spot. Slowly, she began leaving small things for him. A folded blanket, a cup of water near his chair, a picture book left open on the table. She didn't expect him to respond, and he didn't at first. But she kept doing it anyway, not to change him, but to be there. She had no idea that her quiet actions were already starting to make a difference. Without realizing it, Julia had begun her job not just as a housekeeper, but as someone who truly saw Leo. In the days that followed, Julia began to observe Leo more closely. She kept doing her daily tasks, cleaning rooms and preparing meals, but she paid extra attention whenever Leo was nearby. He still didn't talk or look at anyone, and he still hugged his old stuffed animal tightly, but Julia was starting to notice small things. One afternoon, while walking through the hallway, she accidentally dropped a wooden spoon. It wasn't loud, just a soft thump against the floor, but Leo flinched. His shoulders moved slightly, and his head turned just a bit. Julia paused. She didn't say anything. She just watched him for a few seconds. He didn't look at her, but the small reaction stayed in her mind. If he was completely deaf, why did he react like that? It didn't seem like a coincidence. It felt real. From that moment, Julia started paying more attention to the way Leo responded to the world around him. The next morning, Julia tested something simple. She entered the hallway outside Leo's room and walked slowly. She placed each step carefully and tried not to make noise. Leo didn't react. Then she changed her rhythm. She walked with heavier steps, letting her heels hit the floor harder. Leo was sitting by the door with his stuffed animal. She saw his head tilt slightly, as if he had noticed something. Again, she said nothing. That evening, while mopping the kitchen floor, she tapped the end of the broomstick against the tile 2 times. The sound was dull, not sharp. Leo was nearby, drawing on the edge of a table. At the second tap, he blinked and looked around. Julia didn't move or speak. She watched calmly. It was another small reaction, nothing big, nothing clear, but it meant something. She began to think, maybe Leo didn't hear in the way most people did, but maybe he felt certain things, vibrations, pressure, low sounds. Julia continued these little tests throughout the week. She never made it obvious, and she never told Richard. It wasn't that she was hiding anything. She just wasn't sure what it all meant yet. One day, while dusting the bookshelf in the living room, she lightly tapped the wood twice. Leo was sitting on the couch with his toy. Again, he moved. Just his head, just a little. Another day, she swept the hallway with a broom that made a soft swishing sound. Leo turned his head slightly when she passed by him. Julia noticed he seemed more responsive to certain types of sounds, especially the low, soft ones. She also paid attention to how he reacted when someone walked past him. Heavy footsteps made him shift a bit, while light footsteps didn't. Julia began to think that Leo's world wasn't completely silent. Maybe he didn't hear words or voices, but he noticed movement and pressure around him in some way. Julia didn't jump to conclusions. She didn't try to make a plan or fix anything. She just kept watching and testing. Every time she noticed something new, she made a mental note. She didn't need a notebook. Her mind was clear, and she remembered every detail. When she walked by Leo, she moved at different speeds and weights. Sometimes he flinched. Sometimes his fingers tightened around his toy. These weren't random movements. They were reactions to something he felt. Julia also started placing objects on the floor gently, and then with more force, always watching Leo's body language. His reactions were never big, but they were there, real and consistent. The more she paid attention, the more she felt sure that Leo wasn't as disconnected as people thought. He was living in a world where he picked up different types of signals. Julia began to believe that the boy everyone saw as unreachable might have been listening in his own way. One evening, Julia walked into the dining room where Leo was sitting quietly. She didn't speak. Instead, she stepped firmly on the wooden floor, letting the surface vibrate. Leo's head turned slowly. He didn't look at her, but he noticed something. Julia stood still. She then stepped back slowly, this time with soft, quiet steps. Leo didn't move. She repeated the same action 3 more times that week. Each time, Leo reacted only to the firmer steps. Julia began to understand that his senses worked differently. Maybe it wasn't hearing in the usual way. Maybe it was a mix of feeling and sensing what others couldn't see. She didn't tell Richard, not because she wanted to hide anything, but because she needed more time to understand. It was still just small moments, tiny shifts, slight turns, brief twitches. But to Julia, they spoke loudly. She now saw Leo not as unresponsive, but as someone communicating in a very quiet way. By the end of the week, Julia was convinced that Leo wasn't fully disconnected from the world. She didn't know the full truth, but she knew enough to start changing how she interacted with him. She continued to observe him in silence, never interrupting his routines or pushing him to respond. Instead, she tested new things gently, tapping near his feet, shifting furniture slightly, and watching how he responded to sudden movement or soft background noise. She still hadn't shared any of her thoughts with Richard. She wanted to be sure before saying anything. But deep inside, something had changed. Julia no longer saw Leo as just a silent, distant child. She saw a boy who felt more than he showed, who was quietly tuned into the world in his own way. She continued her work with calmness and care, collecting silent details and holding them close. The boy who seemed lost to everyone else might not be so lost after all. It was a regular afternoon in the mansion. Julia was cleaning the guest room closets, checking for dust or anything left behind. Most of the shelves were empty, but in one of the drawers, under a pile of old cloth, she found something small, an earbud. It was a single wireless earbud, a little dusty, but still in good condition. She looked at it for a moment, then wiped it with a soft cloth and placed it on the nearby table. Later that day, while organizing her phone and thinking about music she used to play for her son, she had an idea. It wasn't planned, and she wasn't even sure why she thought of it. She turned on her phone, connected it to the earbud, and searched for a soft instrumental melody. Then with a slow and careful hand, she walked over to where Leo was sitting and gently placed the earbud near his right ear. At first, Julia didn't expect anything to happen. Leo was holding his stuffed animal like always, his eyes looking down and his face calm but distant. The music played softly, just a slow melody with a calm rhythm and no words. Julia stood still, watching. Then something changed. Leo's eyes widened, just a little. His body didn't move, but his expression shifted. He looked slightly to the side, and his head tilted slowly, as if trying to find the source of something strange. Julia felt her heart race. It wasn't a big reaction, but it was clear. It wasn't like his usual random movements or reactions to touch or vibration. This was different. She didn't speak. She didn't ask anything. She just waited. After a minute, Leo's head leaned a bit more, and his eyebrows pulled together in a way that showed he was trying to understand something. Julia slowly pulled the earbud away and turned off the music, still silent, still watching him closely. Julia repeated the experiment the next day. This time she tried a different sound, nature sounds mixed with soft music. She placed the earbud near Leo's left ear this time, just to see if the reaction would be the same. Once again, Leo didn't jump or panic, but he blinked twice and lifted his head. His fingers moved slightly, loosening their grip on the stuffed animal. He wasn't smiling, but something in his face looked more awake. She noticed his mouth moved slightly, almost like he was feeling the sound inside himself. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't something unconscious. He was trying to understand. That moment made Julia feel something strong inside her. She didn't cheer or cry, but her chest tightened with emotion. She watched Leo carefully and started playing different melodies, always soft, never loud. And every time there was a reaction, small ones, but real. Leo was responding not with fear or confusion, but with attention. For the next few days, Julia kept testing with new sounds. She used her phone to find gentle music, simple beats, or calming tunes. She made sure not to overwhelm Leo. Each time, she waited for the right moment, approached quietly, and placed the earbud near one of his ears. Sometimes she didn't even put it inside, she just held it close enough for the sound to reach. And every time, Leo reacted. He tilted his head, blinked slowly, or turned his eyes toward her hand. Once, while listening to a soft piano song, Leo even smiled a little. Not a big smile, but a soft curve of his lips that disappeared quickly. Julia stood still, barely breathing. She knew what she saw. It wasn't a random twitch. It wasn't imagination. It was real. Leo was not only sensing the vibrations, he was recognizing sound. He was hearing something. And slowly, something inside him was waking up. Julia didn't tell Richard yet. She felt she needed more time, more confirmation. This discovery was too important to rush. She continued her quiet routine, acting as if nothing had changed. But whenever she and Leo were alone, she used those moments to test new types of sounds. Wind, birds, soft voices speaking nonsense words. Leo responded differently depending on the type of audio. With music, he looked calm. With sounds of water or forest, he looked curious. With distant talking, he seemed to focus more deeply. Julia also noticed he had a preference for one ear over the other. His right side always brought stronger reactions. She took note of that. Everything was so subtle, but so full of meaning. She didn't need a loud word or a big gesture. Leo's small changes told her everything. There was something inside him that had been ignored or misunderstood, but now it was becoming visible, bit by bit. One afternoon, Julia sat on the floor across from Leo. He was watching her carefully now, not all the time, but often enough. She held the earbud in her hand, not turning it on yet. Instead, she looked at him, waited for him to meet her eyes, and then played a slow song with soft strings. She placed the earbud next to his ear. This time, Leo didn't just react. He moved his head toward it gently. His eyes stayed open, focused. His hands rested on his lap. Julia watched as his face softened and a tiny smile formed again. It lasted a few seconds longer this time. She knew what she was seeing. It wasn't reflex. It wasn't coincidence. It was awareness. It was understanding. It was hearing. She didn't need proof from a machine or words from a doctor. The boy who had been considered completely deaf was responding to sound. For Julia, this changed everything. Julia had trouble sleeping. The small reactions Leo showed to sound were stuck in her mind. They weren't guesses or dreams. They were real. And yet, everything she had been told about Leo said the opposite. He was supposed to be completely deaf. But what if that wasn't true? What if something had been missed? One morning, while cleaning a hallway near the old medical room, Julia saw a narrow cabinet with a broken handle. She hadn't opened it before. Out of curiosity and driven by her uneasiness, she pulled the door open. Inside were several boxes, dusty bottles, and old folders. Some labels were faded, but others were still readable. She found small containers with long chemical names she didn't recognize. Many looked like they hadn't been used in years. She picked up a few and read the labels carefully. The names were unfamiliar, but something about them felt important. She took pictures with her phone when no one was around. Later that night, Julia sat in her room and started searching online. She entered the names of the medications one by one, copying them exactly from the pictures she had taken. The results came slowly. Some names were linked to antibiotics. Others were related to neurological treatment. One particular medication showed up on multiple medical websites. It had a long scientific name, but the articles mentioned possible side effects in children, especially when used for long periods. One of those side effects was hearing damage, temporary or permanent. Julia stared at the screen, reading the same line over and over. She checked other sources to make sure it wasn't just a single article. The same warning appeared again. Long-term use could affect auditory nerve development. She sat back in her chair, stunned. Was it possible that Leo had taken these drugs? Were they given to him as a child? Her thoughts started spinning fast. The more she read, the more serious it sounded. The next day, she returned to the cabinet and examined the rest of the items. She didn't take anything, but she memorized a few more labels. Some bottles had Leo's name printed on them, with old dates written in pen. That was the confirmation she didn't want. These medications weren't just stored here. They had been used. Julia sat down on the floor, holding one of the small boxes in her hand. Her mind was full of questions. Why were these medicines used? Who prescribed them? Was Richard aware of the risks? She couldn't jump to conclusions. There might be a medical reason. But one thought wouldn't go away. If these drugs were given to Leo for a long time when he was very young, they could have damaged his hearing. Maybe he wasn't born completely deaf. Maybe it happened because of the treatment. Julia felt a wave of discomfort in her chest. Something didn't feel right about the whole story. Julia didn't talk to Richard that day. She didn't know how to bring it up. She had no solid proof, only suspicion. If she told him what she found, he might become defensive or angry. She didn't want to accuse anyone unfairly. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore what she had discovered. She kept thinking about the way Leo responded to sound. Those weren't random reactions. Julia had tested them over and over. Now, knowing what the medicine could do, it all felt connected. But she also realized something else. No one seemed to have looked at Leo closely in a long time. Everyone had accepted the diagnosis and moved on. Julia felt that Leo had been placed in a silent world and left there, without anyone really checking if that world still made sense. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed the medicine bottles back in the cabinet. Something was wrong. She was sure of it now. The following days were heavy. Julia moved through her tasks with care, but her mind was always busy. Every time she saw Leo, she watched him with a new kind of attention. She paid close attention to his body language, the way he moved his head when people walked by, and how he reacted to light sounds around him. All these small details supported what she now believed. Leo might still hear something. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not clearly, but something. And if that was true, then everything about how he was treated needed to change. Julia wanted to help, but she also knew this wasn't something she could fix alone. She kept quiet, but inside, she was preparing. She reread the medical articles, saved the links, and organized her notes. She didn't want to act on emotion. She wanted to be ready, with facts. If she decided to speak to Richard, she needed to be certain about what she was saying. One night, Julia sat on her bed holding her phone, scrolling through the photos of the medicine bottles again. Her thoughts were racing. It was no longer just a question of whether Leo was deaf. Now it was about something deeper, whether he had ever been given the chance to be truly understood. Maybe everyone, including Richard, had focused so much on coping with the loss of his wife and the silence of the house that no one had paid close enough attention to Leo. Maybe the boy had been trying to show signs for years, but no one saw them. Julia felt a growing sense of responsibility. She couldn't prove everything yet, but one thing was clear. Something about Leo's story had been missed. She didn't know who was responsible or how it had happened, but deep in her heart, a quiet certainty formed. Something was wrong. And maybe, just maybe, Leo had never been truly listened to. Julia had spent days thinking about what to do next. After everything she had seen, Leo reacting to sounds, the discovery of the medication, and the way his expressions changed, she knew she couldn't stop now. It wasn't just about observation anymore. She needed to take one more step. That morning, after finishing her chores, she walked to Leo's room and found him sitting on the floor like usual, hugging his old stuffed animal. The sun came in weakly through the window, casting a soft light on the carpet. Julia sat down in front of him, slow and calm. She took the wireless earbud from her pocket and showed it to him. Her voice was gentle and quiet. "Leo," she said, "I'm going to play a sound now, okay?" He didn't answer, but he looked at her. That was enough. She connected the earbud to her phone, selected a soft piece of music, and placed the earbud near his ear. The music started playing. It was a calm melody, just piano and strings, quiet and slow. Julia didn't speak. She watched Leo closely. At first he stayed still. Then his eyes blinked and his eyebrows pulled together slightly. His forehead creased, showing confusion or maybe concentration. Julia kept the volume low and didn't move the earbud. She noticed his head turn a little, just like before. Then something happened. Leo opened his mouth slightly. At first, no sound came out. He closed it again. His eyes stayed fixed on Julia's face. Then, in a very low voice, more like a whisper, he said, "I think... heard... Mommy." Julia froze. She couldn't move. Couldn't even breathe. The words came slowly, each one spaced apart, almost like he was trying to remember how to say them. They weren't loud, and they weren't clear, but they were real. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and the word he used, mommy, cut straight through her heart. Julia's hands started shaking. She didn't know what to say. For a moment, everything stopped. Leo had gone back to holding his stuffed toy, but his face looked different. His lips were still slightly parted, as if he was surprised by the sound of his own voice. Julia leaned in closer, gently. "Leo," she said softly, "can you say that again?" He didn't respond. He looked away, then down, but there was no fear in his face, just quiet. Julia didn't push. She knew this wasn't the time to ask for more. What mattered was what had just happened. He had spoken. Not because someone told him to, not because he was forced, but because something inside him had connected with that moment. It wasn't just about hearing the music. It was something deeper. That word, mommy, was full of meaning. Julia felt the tears starting to rise, but she held them back. She didn't want to scare him or ruin the moment. She sat with him for a long time, not speaking, just staying near. Her mind was spinning with thoughts, but her heart felt full. Leo's voice had been soft, broken, almost like someone talking in their sleep. But it was there. It meant he had stored those words somewhere, that he had memories, feelings, maybe even thoughts he had never shared. Julia thought about everything the doctors had said about him, how he wouldn't speak, how he was unreachable. And now, here he was, whispering a word that no one had heard from him before. She couldn't stop thinking about why he had chosen that word. Maybe the music had reminded him of something. Maybe it triggered a memory. Or maybe, after all this time, he simply needed to say it. Julia realized something else. This wasn't a small achievement. This was a sign, a key. Leo wasn't just reacting anymore. He was trying to communicate. Julia wiped a tear from her cheek quietly. She didn't want Leo to see her cry, even though the tears came from joy and shock. She looked at him again. He had gone back to his usual position, sitting with his toy in his arms, staring down. But something was different now. The room didn't feel the same. Julia knew that something important had just happened, not just a change in behavior, but a shift in connection. Leo had made a choice to speak. That meant something had reached him, something emotional, something real. Julia couldn't explain how or why, but she knew this wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a one-time thing. It was the beginning of something new. She stood up slowly and gave him a small smile. "Thank you, Leo," she whispered. Then she stepped away, letting him be. Her chest felt heavy and light at the same time. This was no longer about curiosity or doubt. As Julia left the room and walked down the hallway, her mind felt clear for the first time in weeks. She wasn't confused anymore. She wasn't unsure. She'd seen something real, heard something real, and now she understood what her role truly was. She wasn't just a housekeeper. She wasn't just someone passing through. She had been placed here for a reason. Leo had opened a door, and she had to protect that. She had to make sure that nothing closed it again. She wasn't going to rush anything or make promises she couldn't keep. But from now on, she would be Leo's voice when needed, his support when things got hard. The world had treated him like he couldn't feel, speak, or connect. But that was wrong. Leo had a voice. He had something to say. And now, Julia's mission was clear. She would protect that voice with everything she had. Julia had decided to do another sound test with Leo. The last time he had spoken, even if just a few words, was still fresh in her mind. She felt that something deep inside him had been awakened. That afternoon, she sat with Leo again in his room. He was quiet, holding his stuffed animal, watching her carefully. She smiled softly, connected the earbud to her phone, and picked a soft instrumental track. "Ready?" she asked quietly. Leo gave no reply, but his body stayed relaxed. Julia moved closer, gently bringing the earbud toward his ear. As the music started, Leo blinked, his head tilting like before. Julia watched closely. noting every reaction. Then just as he opened his mouth slightly like he might speak again, the bedroom door flew open. Richard stood there, eyes wide with shock. He looked directly at Julia, saw the earbud, and his face changed immediately, from confusion to rage. "Oh, what are you doing?" Richard shouted, stepping into the room. His voice was loud and filled with anger. Julia stood up quickly, holding the phone in one hand, the earbud still playing music in the other. "It's not what you think," she tried to say, but he interrupted her again. "Are you putting sound in his ear? He's deaf. You can't do that." Leo looked startled and backed away slightly. Richard's voice filled the room with tension. "You had no right," he yelled. Julia tried to explain, but he wasn't ready to listen. Then something completely unexpected happened. Leo dropped his stuffed animal, stood up from the floor, and ran to Julia. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist and held her as if he didn't want to let go. Both Julia and Richard froze. The room went silent for a second. Then, in a quiet but clear voice, Leo said something neither of them were ready to hear. "I heard a sound." His arms lowered, and the anger on his face slowly disappeared. He looked at Leo, unable to speak. Julia didn't move either. Leo still held her tightly, pressing his face against her stomach. Then he looked up at his father and repeated more clearly this time, "I heard." His voice wasn't strong, but it was full of meaning. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He just stared at his son, blinking, trying to understand what had just happened. For years, he had believed Leo was completely deaf. He had built his entire life around that belief. But now, here was Leo, standing, speaking, reacting to sound, something that was supposed to be impossible. The moment felt heavy, real, and undeniable. Julia finally stepped back just a little, placing her hand on Leo's back. Richard looked between the two of them, eyes full of disbelief. His world had just shifted completely. The room stayed silent for a while. No one moved. Richard sat down on the edge of the bed slowly, still staring at his son. "Say it again," he said quietly. Leo nodded and whispered once more, "I heard." It wasn't just a word anymore. It was the truth. Richard put his hands over his face for a moment. When he lowered them, his expression had changed. He looked tired, broken, but also more open. "How long has this been happening?" he asked Julia. She told him everything, the earbud, the reactions, the medications she found, and the research she had done. Richard listened in silence. When she mentioned the drugs, his face tightened. "I thought they were helping," he muttered. "I didn't know." Julia didn't judge him. She simply nodded and said, "Maybe it's time to stop them." Richard didn't argue. He stood up and said firmly, "Stop the medicine. Today." There was no hesitation in his voice this time. In the days that followed, everything changed. Richard called the doctor and ordered the immediate suspension of all medication. He didn't offer long explanations. He just said it was time for a new evaluation. Julia continued her quiet sessions with Leo, playing different sounds, music, and voices. And Leo kept responding. He smiled more often. He reacted when someone called his name in a soft voice. He even tried repeating simple words. The mansion, once filled only with silence, began to carry new sounds. Gentle ones, small ones, but important ones. Richard spent more time watching Leo, sitting nearby while Julia worked with him. He didn't interfere. He just observed, trying to understand the son he had misunderstood for so long. Julia kept track of Leo's reactions, always gentle, always patient. The old routines started to fade, replaced by new ones filled with trial, error, and discovery. It was clear now that Leo could hear. By the end of the week, there was no more doubt. Leo heard sounds. He didn't process them like other children, and he didn't speak fluently, but he was no longer the silent boy everyone believed him to be. Richard watched him laugh softly at a cartoon on Julia's phone, saw him tap his foot to a rhythm, and even heard him whisper the word "again" when he wanted to hear a song replayed. The truth was no longer hidden. It had been there all along, waiting. Richard knew there was still a long way to go, but something important had happened. A door had opened. For the first time, father and son shared something real, something that connected them beyond silence. Richard looked at Julia one evening and simply said, "Thank you." Julia didn't reply with words. She just nodded, knowing her role wasn't over. But now, she wasn't alone. The truth had changed everything, and it couldn't be ignored anymore. Julia couldn't stop thinking about the medication. Even after seeing Leo's progress without it, she needed more than internet articles and suspicions. She needed a professional opinion. One evening, after finishing her work, she took one of the pill bottles she had saved and wrapped it in a cloth. The next day, during her break, she visited an old friend from nursing school who had become a doctor. Her name was Dr. Helena Costa. Julia didn't give many details. She just handed her the bottle and asked, "Can you tell me if this could affect a child's hearing?" Helena looked at the label, then at Julia. "This is a strong compound," she said. "Not meant for children, especially not long-term." She asked Julia for some time to dig deeper. The next day, Helena called her back and said, "You were right to be worried. The substance in the bottle had been involved in serious cases before." Julia felt her stomach drop. Dr. Helena sat with Julia and explained everything she had found. The active ingredient in the drug could interfere with auditory nerve development, especially in children under 5. The bottle Julia brought showed repeated use over months, maybe even years. Then Helena pointed to the name on the prescription label, Dr. Atticus Morrow. "This name is familiar," she said. After checking her database, she discovered something shocking. Dr. Morrow had lost his medical license several years ago. He had been accused of unethical medical practices involving children. According to official records, he partnered with private pharmaceutical labs and prescribed unapproved experimental drugs, sometimes without the full consent of the parents. The medications were part of hidden clinical trials. Julia's heart raced as she listened. It wasn't just a mistake. It was intentional. Leo might have been used as a test subject. She thanked Helena for the information, then returned to the mansion, her hands shaking, unsure how to share this with Richard. Julia waited until Leo was asleep. Then she asked Richard to sit down in the living room. She placed the bottle on the table and showed him the documents Helena had printed for her. At first, Richard said nothing. He read every line, flipping pages slowly. His face became pale. When he reached the part where Dr. Morrow's license had been revoked, he dropped the paper and leaned forward, holding his head. "I trusted him," he said, his voice low. "I believed everything he said about Leo. I let him give those pills without asking more questions." Julia sat beside him but didn't say anything right away. She let him process it. After a few minutes, he looked at her and said, "He did this to my son." His voice cracked. Julia nodded. "But now we know, and now we can do something." Richard looked at her with tired eyes. "I should have protected him," he said. "I failed." "You didn't know," she said. "You were grieving, alone and desperate for help." Richard shook his head. "But that doesn't erase what happened." Julia agreed, but reminded him that staying stuck in guilt wouldn't help Leo now. What mattered was what they did next. "Leo is waking up," she said. "We can't go backward." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right," he whispered. That night, they stayed up talking. They made a list of things they needed to do: contact a new doctor for a full, independent evaluation, gather all medical records connected to Dr. Morrow, and possibly find a lawyer. Richard admitted that he still didn't understand how everything had gone so wrong, but he was ready to face the truth. Julia felt a new energy between them. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was determination. For the first time, they were working as a team, not just for Leo's safety, but for his justice. The next morning, they began making calls. Richard reached out to a pediatric specialist in another city, someone with no connection to Dr. Morrow or the old lab. Julia helped organize documents and made a timeline of Leo's treatments. They found inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, missing signatures, and notes written in vague language. It became clear that Dr. Morrow had been careless, even deceptive. Julia also contacted Helena again to ask for her help as a witness if they needed one. Helena agreed without hesitation. Meanwhile, Leo continued to improve. Without the medication, his reactions became stronger and more frequent. He smiled more, responded to low sounds, and even repeated a few more words. Richard watched every moment with quiet emotion. He took notes, filmed small clips, and kept records of everything. They weren't just looking for someone to blame, they were preparing a case, step by step. And most of all, they were making sure Leo was finally being seen. At the end of that week, Julia and Richard sat together in the kitchen. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Leo was asleep in his room. The lights were dim, and the paperwork was stacked neatly on the table. "We've come far," Julia said. Richard nodded, "but there's more ahead." Julia knew he was right. There would be questions, investigations, maybe even court dates. But they had started something important. They were no longer relying on vague diagnoses or half-truths. They were rebuilding everything from facts. Julia felt proud, not of herself, but of the change she saw in Richard. He was no longer frozen by guilt. He was active, focused, and willing to fight for his son. "Leo deserves the truth," Julia said. Richard replied, "and he deserves a future based on it." Together they had taken the first step toward justice. The damage couldn't be erased, but now they were finally in control of what came next. Even knowing the risks, Julia and Richard moved forward with the complaint. They gathered all documents, reports, videos, and medical records and sent them to the authorities. Days later, they were contacted by the district attorney's office. From that point on, the investigation began. It wasn't easy. Julia received strange messages from unknown numbers. Richard got a phone call warning him to stay quiet. Online, some people accused them of making things up for attention, but neither of them backed down. They kept all the threats and forwarded them to the investigator in charge. Meanwhile, the prosecution team uncovered even more evidence. Other families had similar stories about Dr. Morrow. Children who had been part of treatment programs that were never properly explained. It all started to make sense. The case was solid. After years of silence and confusion, someone was finally going to answer for what happened. The court date was officially scheduled. It was time to face the truth. The trial brought tension into the house, but it also brought purpose. Julia was asked to testify. She prepared by reviewing every note, every timeline, every video of Leo's progress. She wasn't nervous, she was focused. Richard was also called to the stand. He felt ashamed, but knew he had to be honest. The court needed to understand that this wasn't just about medical mistakes, it was about trust being broken. On the day of the hearing, Julia entered the courtroom calmly. She sat in front of the judge, the lawyers, and a small crowd of observers. She told her story clearly, how she found the medicine, what she observed in Leo, and what she uncovered about Dr. Morrow's past. When Richard spoke, he admitted that he had followed the doctor's advice without asking questions. "I was grieving," he said, "and I made the wrong choice. But now, I'm here to fix it." His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. Leo didn't go to court, but his presence was still felt. Julia and Richard had collected several recordings showing his development after the medication was stopped. Videos showed him reacting to sound, speaking short words, smiling during songs, and interacting more with his surroundings. They also brought his drawings, simple pictures of people holding hands, a house with music notes, and even a sketch of Julia with the word "Mom" written under it. The judge reviewed everything carefully. The defense tried to discredit Julia and Richard, suggesting they were mistaken or exaggerating, but the evidence was too strong. Other families also stepped forward with their own stories. One mother cried while explaining how her daughter lost her ability to hear after taking the same drug. After several long sessions, the jury reached a decision. Dr. Atticus Morrow was found guilty on multiple counts: unethical conduct, illegal drug testing, and endangering minors. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read, but the silence meant victory. When Julia and Richard returned to the mansion, everything felt different. There was a sense of relief, but also a deep change in the way they looked at the future. They no longer felt trapped in guilt or fear. Leo, now more open and expressive, greeted them with a big hug. He didn't understand the legal details, but he sensed that something important had happened. Over the next few weeks, changes continued. Leo was enrolled in a special school with speech therapy and inclusive learning. Julia accompanied him during the first days. He was nervous but curious. Slowly, he began to participate in group activities. He listened to music on his small headphones, sometimes moving his body to the rhythm. One day, he got up and danced in front of his classmates. It wasn't a perfect dance, but it was real and full of life. Julia recorded it and sent it to Richard, They watched it together that night and smiled. The legal victory wasn't the end, it was the start of something new. Richard began working part-time again, but made sure to be home every afternoon. He and Julia shared responsibilities and continued helping Leo adjust to his new routine. The school team sent regular reports showing steady improvement in Leo's language skills. He began forming short sentences and recognizing songs. Julia met with a family counselor who helped her start the official adoption process. It didn't take long. With Richard's full support, Julia was legally recognized as Leo's adoptive mother. The moment she signed the final paper, she felt something shift inside her. She wasn't just helping anymore. She was truly part of Leo's life, and he was part of hers. Leo didn't say much that day, but he gave Julia a drawing of their family. Him in the middle, Julia on one side, Richard on the other. That piece of paper now hung proudly on the kitchen wall. The mansion, once heavy with silence, had completely changed. Music played in the background during breakfast. Leo laughed often, sometimes even making silly jokes. He asked questions, pointed at things, and danced every time a song came on. Julia created a small corner for him in the living room, filled with books, instruments, and drawing supplies. Richard installed new lights and even painted a few walls with warm colors. The cold, empty feeling that once filled the house was gone. Visitors who hadn't been there in months couldn't believe the difference. It wasn't just the sounds that made it feel alive. It was the energy. A real family now lived there, with love, challenges, and hope. Julia sometimes stood in the hallway just listening, not for signs of danger, but for proof of life. And every time she heard Leo's laughter or footsteps running through the halls, she knew the silence was over. Their home was finally complete. Leo continued to grow, and so did his abilities. What once seemed impossible now became part of his daily life. His speech improved through constant therapy, practice, and patience. He still needed help sometimes, and some words were harder than others, but he was no longer silent. He asked questions, told short stories, and even laughed out loud. Over time, Leo developed a special interest in music. Julia noticed it first, how he reacted to certain sounds and rhythms. Richard began showing him simple instruments, and Leo enjoyed testing them all. He loved pressing piano keys and hearing the different notes. He even started creating short tunes with a keyboard app on a tablet. At school, his teachers supported his interest and gave him access to music classes. Every note seemed to bring him joy. It was more than a hobby. It was his way of expressing himself. His journey had brought him here, to a place of sound, learning, and joy. By the time Leo was 10, he had already written several small melodies. They weren't complicated, but they were full of emotion. Some were happy and fast, others were soft and slow. Julia encouraged him every step of the way. She printed his sheet music, helped him name the pieces, and even made a folder where he could keep them. Richard built a small music corner in the house, a keyboard, a microphone, a speaker, and shelves for notebooks and instruments. Leo spent hours there after school, trying new sounds and recording little songs. His teachers also noticed his growth, not just in music, but in confidence. He began talking more in class, joining group activities, and even making new friends. He wasn't the same quiet boy from before. His past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer held him back. Leo had learned to live with it, to move forward, and most of all, to express what had always been inside. One day, Julia received an email from the school. A local foundation was organizing a special event to honor students who had shown exceptional personal progress. They wanted to recognize Leo. He had been nominated by his music teacher and chosen by the committee. Julia showed the message to Richard, who smiled and said, "He deserves it." They told Leo that evening, and his reaction was simple. He nodded, smiled, and said, "Can I play a song?" The event was set for the following month at the community auditorium. Leo would receive a medal and have the chance to speak if he wanted. He practiced a short melody he had written himself. A calm, simple tune with a slow ending. Julia helped him get a nice shirt and clean shoes for the big day. Richard bought him a small pin in the shape of a musical note to wear. Everything was ready. Leo didn't seem nervous. He looked proud. The night of the ceremony arrived. The auditorium was filled with families, teachers, and guests. A large banner hung on the wall. Stories of strength. One by one, students were called to the stage to receive their medals. Some spoke, others just waved. When Leo's name was called, Julia squeezed his hand gently, and Richard gave him a nod. Leo walked to the stage calmly, holding a small piece of paper in his hand. The host handed him the medal, and the crowd clapped. Then the host asked, "Would you like to say something?" Leo took the microphone with both hands. He looked at the crowd, then down at the paper, then up again. "The first sound I heard," he said slowly, "came from her heart." He turned and pointed at Julia. The room went silent for a moment, then filled with quiet gasps and soft sobs. Julia covered her mouth with her hand, already crying. Tears streamed down Julia's face. She hadn't expected a speech, and she definitely hadn't expected those words. Richard, standing beside her, didn't speak. He just smiled and looked at Leo with proud eyes. Leo continued, "She believed in me. She listened, even when no one else did. That's when I started to hear." The audience was completely silent, some people wiping their eyes. Leo didn't say much more. He ended with a simple thank you, then stepped down and returned to his seat. Julia hugged him tightly. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Richard placed his hand on Leo's shoulder. They sat together for the rest of the ceremony, holding hands, quietly sharing the moment. The pain of the past, misdiagnoses, silence, guilt, was still part of their story, but it had changed shape. It no longer controlled them. It had led them here, to this moment of truth, growth, and connection. That night, back at the mansion, everything felt peaceful. Leo placed his medal on a shelf in his room, right next to his keyboard. He turned on a song he liked and sat on the floor, humming along. Julia watched him from the doorway, smiling. Richard joined her a minute later. "He's come so far," he said. Julia nodded. "And he's not done yet." The house no longer felt cold or silent. It had music, laughter, and light. Leo spoke more every day. He sang softly while brushing his teeth. He danced around the living room in socks. He asked questions about everything. More than hearing sounds, Leo had learned to communicate with the world and with the people he loved. He had learned to feel safe, to trust, and to give love back. He wasn't just the boy who used to live in silence. He was now the boy who shared his voice and his heart with everyone around him. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.